Okay, comrades, welcome to everybody. It's good to see comrades here from Britain, Ireland, USA, Cyprus, Denmark. I hope I haven't missed anybody else. And of course, Richard, who's speaking to us from Italy. The subject of the meeting today is migration, and sorry, just let me find my. Just like to introduce this by saying that obviously history has witnessed countless major resettlements of population. The internal migration of tens of millions, for instance, this is probably the biggest one, of tens of millions from rural areas to urban centers in China as it industrializes and proletarianizes the population. I think one of the biggest was the emigration of 13 million Italians around the turn of the 20th century in what became the Italian diaspora. The rapid migration of former plantation slaves in the USA to northern industrial cities, and perhaps the biggest ever single migration of 18 million people displaced by communal slaughter following the partition of India and Pakistan. But what we're witnessing now is by far the most widespread displacement of populations on a worldwide global scale. And of course, it's far from over. By the end of 2022, over 100 million people had been displaced internally or across national frontiers by wars, civil wars, environmental and climate crises, poverty, racism, discrimination, and persecution. From Syria, Afghanistan, Myanmar, Ukraine, of course, Sudan, and other African countries. And this includes over 32 million refugees who are seeking asylum in foreign countries, which was actually, I believe, double the equivalent number 10 years previously. This year alone, over 250,000 migrants have sought refuge in Europe at the most desperate and acute personal risk. And in the last 10 years, at least 20,000 men, women, and children have drowned in the Mediterranean alone, to say nothing of other transit routes. And once they've arrived, the migrant population have been subjected to the most gross human rights violations, and they've been greedily exploited politically by the far right throughout Europe and North America as an easy sitting duck scapegoat and a target for cheap racist demagoguery. And this poses a threat, of course, to the entire working class. Now, when we come to Italy, with its long revolutionary traditions from the workers' factory occupations of the 1920s and the partisan resistance of the 1940s, Italy was not so long ago the home of the world's largest mass communist party in the world outside of the Stalinist bloc. Today, that militant heritage has been apparently swept aside by the growth of ugly, xenophobic far-right parties, by the media mogul Berlusconi, by Salvini's racist Lega, and most shocking of all, perhaps, by Meloni's neo-fascist party, Brothers of Italy, which heads the current government. So how could this have happened? How could it be fought? And what are the prospects for the Italian working class in this situation? So we're very privileged to welcome today Richard Browder, who's a socialist campaigner based in Sicily, and he's active in the migrant solidarity campaign. So over to you, Richard.
Great, thanks, Roger, and thanks everyone for allowing me to participate and talk to you, because I'm very interested to know from the discussion what will come up and what meeting points we have between different countries and different campaigns and struggles. What I'll try to do is first, like I said to Roger before, first I'm going to explain a bit of who I am and the organization I'm a part of, just to give the idea of the perspective that I have on Italy, which will also explain why I concentrate on some things and not so much on others. And then I'm just going to try and do a quick run through of the last 10 years of what happened with immigration into Italy and how the dialectic relationship between immigration and what happened in Italian politics with a big P. Because I think bits of the story probably everyone knows, but I think the full story of the past 10 years doesn't get told much. And I think there are a lot of lessons to learn. And also without that history, it's very difficult to know what situation we're really in today. If that's all right, that sounds all right by everyone. So the organization I'm part of, and just to try and give you an idea of it, and also where it sits in the left today in Italy. So so I'm from London. I've been in Italy since beginning of 2015, so 8 years now. And for most of that time, I've been involved with this big organization called ARCI, which is ARCI, which stands for has a very general name of the Association for the Italian Association of Recreational and Cultural Activities. But what it is, it's a bit of the old Communist Party, or one of those kind of interesting front groups that was created over the 50s and 60s, which brought together people from the Socialist Party and the Communist Party, and where they could do things together culturally, which is a lot how the big left-wing trade unions worked in Italy as well. And it still has those two kind of hearts beating in it, which in Italy means it has a kind of social enterprise side, and then it has a more activist political side. Sometimes they live well together, those two sides. Other times they come into conflict, and people kind of move in and out between them. And part of it simply because in Palermo, it's fairly active, and we have a local branch in the neighborhood I live in, which is called Red Pig, Porco Rosso in Italian. And in 2015-16, I started with other friends trying to get involved in migrant solidarity stuff. And it was basically the only club, the only group that opened their doors and said, here's the keys, use our space, do what you want, which I think is kind of very indicative, right? There weren't the kind of far left parties, don't have buildings, they don't have resources. And so really it was a quite center leftish civil society organization with an interesting left-wing political tradition behind it, which we could actually use. So ARCI is probably the biggest non-religious membership-based organization in Italy. It's not a party, but we're very close to what is now called Sinistra Italiana, which is like just means the Italian left, which is now in an electoral coalition with the Green Party, which we don't really like, but that's what's happened. We have the Sinistra Italiana has very few MPs, just has a couple now. But among whom there is Niccolo Frottoiani and also Abubakar Sumahoro, who is originally from Ivory Coast and is the only left-wing African-born member of the Italian Parliament. So we're quite proud that he is part of our general political landscape. And if we can talk more about ARCI afterwards and explain a bit of the tradition that we're in, which of course in the Italian scheme of things, everything is very different from how things pan out in other countries. The activities I'm involved in I'm doing very practical solidarity work. So that means a lot of legal advice, social advice. We run a drop-in for migrants every Wednesday. We open the doors, anyone's welcome, Italians are welcome. It's called the Sans Papier Center. And we're quite proud of the idea that sans papier, without documents, could mean Italians as well, because there are also Italians who don't have documents, and Italians are very welcome to come and get legal advice and so on as well. We've been doing that for 7 years now, and that means that we've seen thousands of people. We've talked to people, in depth. And so that means while doing that very practical work, of course, you get a great insight into the problems coming up, what people are really facing on the ground. When it's possible, we try to get people involved in collective action. That can mean all sorts of things. At the moment, it means we're doing demonstrations and campaigning against the local council for people to be on the official council lists, which sounds like a very dull thing, but really it's the difference between people having access to welfare or not. And given that lots of people aren't on the council lists and the council doesn't get their act sorted, that means people end up not being able to feed their children or renew their documents and all sorts of things like this. And that means, working with also diaspora organizations, the Gambian Association, Senegal, Nigeria, Biafra, Bangladesh, bringing people together and trying to build unified campaigns. So that's the more political side of what we do as well. For me, so like I said, I've been here since 2015, which in some ways was a very interesting moment to come into things because things started to change a lot. But really, there's been change Italy has an extraordinary flexibility in politics. And while I've been here for 7 years, and there's been, I think, 5 governments, so things move very quickly. And what I want to take you back to is the Arab Spring, because at least the way I see it, and my comrades see it, is that was the moment where really, even though we could go back further to talk about Italian immigration, to talk about what happened under Berlusconi and the deals with Gaddafi and so on. With the Arab Spring, the whole composition, the whole game changes, because the idea, the whole plan had been to stop illegal immigration, or to stop maritime immigration by Italy doing a deal with Libya. And that deal had been going on for years in various forms. Libya was a former colony of Italy. There's a very complex relationship between Italy and Libya, which I think is mainly animosity. But there had been this deal. With the Arab Spring, with the assassination of Gaddafi, that deal fell apart. The Arab Spring obviously also began in Tunisia. Tunisia is the closest country by sea to Sicily. And so that meant with the Arab Spring, there were huge amounts of Tunisians coming over. That was the first thing. And Italy had to deal with that and try to deal with it just by giving people documents to let them go on to France, which is where they wanted to go. And then as the Arab Spring spread into Syria, Syrians started to get planes and going to Egypt. And then from Egypt, crossing into Libya, and from Libya, taking boats to come into Italy. Right, so all the dynamics are to do with where you can get a plane to, where you can get a visa to, how you can get entrance, right? And we can go back to that, to the visa system as well. In 2012, the Libyan route reopened, and this meant that people in Libya started either self-organizing, organizing for Libyans to go over, for Syrians to come over, for Egyptians to come over, and in that moment, there was a kind of act of solidarity from the Italian state between the center-left being very much a kind of centrist center-left being in power, and also with the history of the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church in Italy being an important political force that had a certain amount of internationalism and an idea that you must welcome people. Not only did Italy not try and reject people initially, it's all a bit more complicated, but it was relatively open, and indeed launched, after a big shipwreck happened in October 2013, launched a maritime naval mission to do search and rescue in the Mediterranean, which lasted 10 months. So in 2013-14, we have a situation of relative openness, a lot of people arriving, but 2 things changed then. One is that in 2014, the government started to shift a bit right-wing, started to realize that people were still coming by boat, and actually it wasn't just going to go, this problem wasn't going to go away quickly, also because of the continuing spread of war that had begun from the insurrections in the Middle East and North Africa. At the same time, the Syrians stopped trying to take the boats, which was very interesting. The Syrians realized that it was too deadly. It was too deadly to take the Mediterranean route. It's a long route. There are all sorts of reasons that it's very deadly. You have to be rescued on that route. It's very difficult to do it directly from Libya to Sicily or Libya to Lampedusa. So what the Syrians did is they started waiting in Turkey and not coming over to Egypt. And then we know what happened then in 2015 which is the million or the 500,000 Syrians that have been waiting in Turkey, took the land route or start taking boats through to Greece, and coming through on the eastern way instead of on the southern way. So in 2014, there are still people coming over. Italy's starting to think about how to close down on the migration, on this new form of immigration, and starts to talk to Libya to see if they can do some new deals with some kind of government in Libya. That's when they start thinking about it. In 2015, everything starts to explode. So April 2015, there is a huge shipwreck. Over 1,000 people die in one ship. That's April 15th, 2015, April 18th. There's demonstrations, there's huge pressure on the government. And then shortly after that, it's the summer of 2015, there is the young boy, Alan Kurdi, who is photographed on the beach in Greece. And the whole world starts to wake up to what is going on, to the plight of people who are arriving. The people arriving by sea in Italy at this point aren't Kurds and Syrians anymore. What's happened is because the Libyan route has opened up, all of the people who are blocked in East and West Africa, who for whatever reason have a dream of Europe, can be funneled into Libya on their own, trafficked, everything in between, smuggling organizations, family members, and start to make their way into Libya to come through. I imagine most of you know that. What happens is in 2015, and just to kind of, these are all facts that you probably remember, by October 2015, there's this huge push through into Germany of the 500,000 or million, the numbers we never understand, Syrians. Among the Syrians, there's also huge amounts of Moroccans and Turks and all sorts of people who come in with this flow of people who manage to force Europe to bring down their walls for about 2 weeks. So Merkel does this huge act of generosity and says, yes, you're all welcome. She does it at the last minute in order to avoid Austrian police beating the heads of Syrian refugees on her border. She opens the gates and then shuts them after 2 weeks. And like as a domino effect, all the borders get shut again, all the way to Greece, and people have been trapped in Greece ever since. And we see as countries and the states in the East try to play with these border games in their geopolitical games between them still. At that point, there is an attempt by Europe, by the EU, to create a new system which will block the flows. And the new system is called the hotspot system. The hotspot system is entirely criminological. It's all based on the idea that immigration is a crime. The word hotspot comes from the zero tolerance policy in New York in the 90s, and the idea that you have to look for where the crime is going to happen, and you put your police there and they wait for the crime before it happens. And so they have the same idea. We're going to put police at various points along the European borders who are waiting for immigration to happen, and we're going to try and seal it and stop it at that point of arrival. What does this mean in practical terms? And it's really important for what happens in Italy next. It means that when people arrived in Italy, there would be, let's say someone leaves on Libya on a boat, they're rescued by the military, they're brought into Lampedusa, they're transferred from Lampedusa to Agrigento in Sicily, and then some police say, right, you can decide, either you can stay in our asylum seeker hostel here, or you can go wherever you want to go. You want to go to Switzerland or Norway, make your way. If you want to stay here, in a few days' time, we'll do your fingerprints in the police station, and we'll start processing and get your documents going. And in 2015, I met lots of people like that. They've been dumped in the streets, Eritreans, Ethiopians, Somalians, Syrians, been dumped in the streets because they'd said, actually, I don't want documents in Italy. I want to go on to Germany or Norway. So the police said, right, just go. We turn a blind eye, please move on. In 2016, with the hotspot system, they decided they would fingerprint everyone. And with the Dublin Agreement, whether you imagine you know it, means that you can claim asylum, essentially you can claim documents, only in the first European country you enter. So what happened before is Italy had found a way around the Dublin Agreement, had found a way around having so much immigration. In 2016, the EU imposed saying, no, you're going to have to register everyone who comes in. Right? So this fundamentally changes the entire landscape in Italy, because up till that point, the church, politicians, the people, activists, for everyone, it was kind of easier to say, well, we welcome everyone, because really people didn't want to stay. What happened after 2016 is people were forced to stay in Italy. And not only were they forced to stay, they weren't Syrians anymore. They were Nigerians and Gambians and Senegalese, mainly West Africans. So rather than being, that's to make very large generalizations, but I think they're important, rather than being well-educated English-speaking Syrians who could learn Italian quickly or something like that, instead you had very dark-skinned farmers from West Africa, right? It really changed who was coming and who was staying. And that meant that it brought up all sorts of different kind of racist antagonisms, which politicians played on. It also meant that that you had people being antagonistic on both sides. You had the Italian population being annoyed that now they actually have high immigration, and it's not actually, in very relative terms, Italian immigration is quite low, but we'll get back to that. And that these were Black Africans. And on the other side, you have the West African migrants who are turning up who don't actually want to be in Italy at all, mainly because most of them speak Italian and French, English and French, and have no desire to be in a country where they can't use those languages. This meant you started getting all sorts of, we started seeing 2016 and 17 protests by migrants being exploited in work based on kind of racist divisions. We saw protests by migrants in their asylum seeker hostels because they were being treated badly. And all of those protests from below, which we saw a lot, unorganized, spontaneous, but consistent, in the end became kind of fodder for the right-wing media and for groups like the Northern League and the Brothers of Italy. So when Salvini came in 2018, he came in on this wave of anti-migrant sentiment, which in many ways was a response to the protests and the struggles of the African working class in Italy, who were demanding their basic rights as asylum seekers and as immigrants. I got to Salvini. I'll just go back a moment. Another thing that happened before Salvini came in, so when we still had the Democratic Party, as I said before, the Democratic Party already from 2014-15 started to shift right on immigration issues. What they also started doing was criminalizing, using criminal law to stop not just immigrants, but also people who are helping them, also the solidarity groups. So in broad terms, what we saw from 2014 onwards, all under the Democratic Party, was this huge wave of criminalization, which had the effect of putting thousands of migrants in jail as boat drivers, and also targeting dozens of the rescue missions at sea, accusing them of people smuggling and trafficking human beings. So we have this huge wave of criminalization to try and stop not just migrants, but also migrant solidarity. All of that happens before the Northern League comes to power with the Salvini-Conte government in 2018. And I say that because I think, as Marxists, as leftists, obviously it's important to understand also the center-left power that we're dealing with. And when the center-left arrives and continues to arrive in Italy, telling us that they're somehow the anti-racist hope, it's always important that we remember the damage that they already did before the right wing came, how they prepared the playing field for them. So that brings us up through to 2018. The period since then has essentially been one of closure, of rejection, of racism, and dominance by the right wing. That's the last 5 years, even since Giorgia Meloni came to power. the hotspot system worked to trap people in Italy. It was the deal done in 2017. The centre-left finally did a deal with Libya, and has continued to maintain, the government has continued to maintain a deal, which is essentially a deal in which they pay the trafficking and the organizations in Libya to keep people stuck in Libya. So migrants from West and East Africa and North Africa continue to arrive in Libya to depart. And we've actually seen some people also now making their way through Tunisia. So it's not only Tunisians that come over from Tunisia, but we now see a lot of Gambian, Senegalese, people from the Ivory Coast, Moroccans, making their way through that route as well. It's probably worth, just to bring us up to this current moment, it might seem like a very bleak picture. I think there are some moments of hope, which is when Salvini came in. His government lasted, or it wasn't really his government, he was Minister of the Interior, but it was dominated by him, lasted about a year, because in the summer of 2019, his government fell apart, partly because of inter-party politics on the right, but also because there was a lot of mass resistance and demonstrations in Italy against the racism of his policies, his Islamophobia, his constant anti-migrant rhetoric. Again, the composition of those demonstrations was very broad. The Catholic Church was very important there, or the left of the Catholic Church, which is an important force in Italy. The kind of soft left was very important. The far left, not so much, and the trade unions, not so much. So it's a struggle that's been brought forward largely by either very independent trade unions or civil society. And I think that's probably something worth reflecting on. Salvini's government fell in summer of 2019. The Five Star Movement, who then dominated politics for a couple of years, who were our kind of post-austerity party, they managed to find this man called Giuseppe Conte, who was a nobody, to be their figurehead leader to bring the government together and form a government. And in some ways, that was extremely positive, because through COVID, it meant we had someone who was not an ideological right-winger during COVID, and actually managed to form an extraordinary level of popular solidarity through the COVID period in a way that I think many comrades in the UK and the US would be envious of, even though in Italy, the political lines fell in different ways. The huge mistake, just to kind of bring to also how Meloni came into power and the dynamics that brought her to power. A huge mistake, a terrible by the centre left, was eventually to get rid of, to push aside the Conte government by bringing in Mario Draghi, who had been the head of the European Central Bank, to oversee Italy's post-COVID finances. This was a complete, I mean, it already happened before in 2011. This was a imposition by Europe on Italy in order to ensure that there would be the correct economic policy from European view. Draghi got a certain amount of support from the centre-left and from liberals because he claimed to be more open-minded about migration than these kind of neo-fascistic politicians that were hanging around Salvini and so on. He proved it was a lie. It was completely, he did absolutely nothing no, it's not true. They tinkered with a few things to make some documents a bit easier for migrants to get. Some of the worst excesses of Salvini's government were pushed aside, but essentially went back to the same thing of deals with Libya, criminalizing boat drivers and NGOs, and increasingly doing deals for deportations with non-European countries. The situation we got to is that by the time we got to the national elections 9 months ago, there was no true centre-left alternative. There was no alternative except for the right wing. The only decisions were between the right and the far right. The left had, or the centre-left had, destroyed itself by believing in the kind of extremely liberal, capitalistic, Keynesian politics of a Draghi government had destroyed the few remaining members of the Five Star Movement that maybe were going towards the left. And so in some ways, I think it's, I think there's been a lot of catastrophe talk about Giorgia Meloni coming to power in the international press. But in some ways, it was quite inevitable. The Italian public has voted in substantially the same ways over the past 5-6 years. The voting categories between the different parties haven't changed that much. What changed is that the centre-left managed to destroy itself by constantly siding with kind of criminalizing Europhile element, rather than pushing towards a different kind of Europe, or trying to push towards opening borders, or actually discussing the very basics of how dynamics of immigration into Italy are happening at the moment.
Richard,
and I've been talking for half an hour.
No, I don't want to break your flow at all, but just to let you know, you've had about 25 minutes. But please go on. It's really interesting.
I'm timing myself. I was just about to say.
Okay, sorry.
No,
Carry
exactly.
on.
No, so I'm going to stop my historical narrative there. I'm just going to pick up on a few concepts and a few things that Roger said as well at the beginning, and then we can open up the debate and questions and so on. So one thing I think that's quite clear is you said, Italy had, I think it was the largest communist party in Western Europe. I think not in the world. I think the Indian Communist Party and others were much bigger. But it used to have this huge communist party. And I think in many people's mind, that tradition, the tradition, whether it's of Gramsci or the extraordinary tradition of the 70s, kind of comes to mind. But unfortunately, that is completely gone. None of that remains. Italy is a left-wing wasteland. It was destroyed and repressed. The Socialist Party was dismantled in scandals in the 80s, and the Communist Party completely collapsed after 89. And so there are bits of that heritage that survive, but unfortunately not much. I emphasize a lot the relationship between immigration and Italian politics on a governmental scale. I think that's a connection which is constant. Unfortunately, it's not something that's shared much among the Italian left, who often see immigration as a kind of a side issue, or they put it into a category with civil liberties and LGBT and women's politics. It all gets pushed a bit to the side, and isn't the economy or pensions or young people. Age categories are seen as much more important, I suppose, as they are in France. I think it's often, so I'll just conclude on this. I think it's also important to understand the dynamics of refugees and immigration. Roger rightly said, how many refugees are coming, and so that global immigration and migration at the moment is at a high. Immigration into Italy is relatively low. Italy has a population of 70 million people. 5 million of those are not Italian. Of those, about a couple of 100,000 arrived by sea from North Africa, right? The vast majority of immigration into Italy happens through legal routes. The biggest populations are Moroccan, Albanian, Chinese, I'm missing one. Tunisian, and many people coming by plane or land, not by sea. So the sea route, which is the illegal means, has become extremely spectacularized. It's become this huge moment in which politics can happen. I'll just finish on this point about refugees and migrants. And it was something that I had to learn when I came here, is that everyone who arrives by boat, if they want to have documents in Italy, unless they already have family here, or children, only if they have children here, have to claim asylum. And the same goes for people arriving by boat in the UK. That's because all other legal means of regularizing your stay in Italy or the UK have been destroyed and eliminated. There are no other legal means. This means that everyone who arrives has to say they are a refugee. Even if everyone is a bogus asylum seeker, they have no choice. It is your only way of staying. I think it's important to recognize, because also it changes what we say as progressives. Because if we say we're only going to, we're going to protect refugees, or we're going to especially protect refugees, and we really want to know if they're refugees, we might end up turning our back on everyone who's arriving. And I think, certainly from my perspective, the real wrong that is being committed is how much the borders have been closed, how little legal entrance is allowed. And I think that the reasons that people want to come to Italy should be something that we discuss after we give people documents, not before. I'll conclude on that point, and I'm looking forward to the questions and the moments you pick up on.
Well, thank you very much, Richard. Very, very interesting. Who wants to come first into the discussion? Any direct questions first? David.
Well, look, many thanks, Richard, for covering quite a historic spectrum, and for dealing with some really nitty-gritty issues, which sometimes on the left we sort of let blur out because there are important issues there to understand. Just one thing I would ask, but then unfortunately I have some family issues, so let me speak a little longer as well. Is in what way has the most recent rise of neo-fascism sort of accelerated all the developments? And are we now looking at particular jeopardy in all relations, in Italy, or is neo-fascism becoming just another capitalist tendency? Dangerous, but not immediately catastrophic. Let me just make one general point, is that, the Declaration of Human Rights, all the liberal declarations, around the world, have, deal with the freedom, in a sense, of capital and of freedom of movement of peoples. And also around the definition of citizenship. Now, can I say that what we're seeing in the world right now is the absolute freedom of capital to move? And on the other hand, an absolute despotic control over physical movement of people. So globalization has really not changed much in terms of the movement of capital. I won't go into trade, but in terms of the control over people, it's horrendous. The controls now are unbelievably tight and cause immense human unhappiness and tragedy, as we saw with that poor kid drowned. So that's the world we're living in now, and we shed a tear, but actually it's not nothing will change. That's a certain reality. And the other thing I need to bring up is that this the people are desperate to come to, particularly to England and to centers of capital as in United States. Now, this is, in a sense, a political movement. I mean, in a sense, it's cultural, political, as you've stressed. Many people speak English and they want to advance themselves in English language areas. But it also, in some very distorted way, reflects the demand for labor. Curiously, I mean, the figures, I put it up on in our WIN debate, that America now has about 30% of the workforce is immigrant. And it goes down to the obvious areas like, sales people and obviously childminders and all of that. But it also is something like 40% in the managerial level and scientific and other things. So it's not just that it's cheap labor. It is cheap labor. America desperate has to have people to come and pick carrots in Alabama. No, let me put it crudely, no white person's going to end up doing that. But, they're going to get Haitians to come in and do it, or somebody else, or maybe you want to kick them out again. But anyway, any big capitalist nation has to depend on ultra low wages in certain sectors. And that's what's happening, certainly in America, and maybe also in Britain. I haven't looked at the detail of the stats now. But in Britain now, there are record levels of immigration. I'm talking about legal immigration, as opposed to those people who are desperately trying to get boats across to Britain, which is also at a peak. So despite the fact that on the left, we would say that, we've got absolute crisis of austerity and desperate capitalist conditions in Britain and Europe and in America, for African people, this is absolute utopia. I have to say it, people don't realize this. Nigerians are streaming into America, and they're rising fast in all kinds of professional and other categories. In fact, they're gaining faster than Indians in America. So as a single national ethnic group or national group. So, if I thought about, which I've done in the past, bringing Zimbabweans across to Britain, they can immediately go into a high school and get education. That's unbelievable. You won't be able to do that in Zimbabwe. You won't be able to do it anywhere else in the world, actually. But you could I could put in 2 of our Zimbabwean comrades into high school education, which they really needed. And they also got skills in editing, photography, journalism, and so forth, which are actually very practical. Now, that's possible in the States even now. If you're not a citizen, you can still go to school. And in fact, you're required to go to school. And in Britain, but nowhere in Africa is that allowed. All right. If you are not a citizen, you're out, and no one's going to. You're going to struggle. And I just want to mention that in South Africa, we've had the most horrendous forms of xenophobia. We think of racism and official, organized, semi-legal, or official racism, as in Italy now, with the way in which the response. But in South Africa, people are burnt to death. It's not just a small matter of being, nasty to immigrants. We've had horror without end in South Africa. We've had about 5, pogroms, in which anyone who is black. Just remember, this is South Africa. Black people are turning on black people. In other words, actually, most South Africans are light brown, if I could dare use the term. And most immigrants from the north are black, really black. So then there's horrendous forms where people can't speak Zulu. And not, by the way, a lot of African people in South Africa don't speak Zulu. So if you don't speak Zulu and you're black, then you could be stoned to death or robbed or humiliated in every possible way. So the scourge, of xenophobia, is an international phenomenon. Just last point I'd make, just almost personally, my name Hempson, it used to be Hempson. Originally, we were Belgian people, apparently. When I tell you that. In other words, whole of mankind came from Africa originally in various forms. And we've all, if we really examine our own personal histories, we'll find we've moved, many different ways. But all of that is now being constrained under current capitalist conditions, despite the fact that capital is actually partly in favor of immigration. And at times we find these terrible moods, of violence against immigrants. So, when we're looking at the concrete politics, as you brought out, Richard, we have to, help develop the left. I find at times, there's all kinds of confusion on the left. These issues are not at all clarified. And I think Gwen has done a marvelous job by actually bringing out these issues so that we can bring them out into the open and clarify the issue and see what can be done. Just one last point, if I could. At times we've had people on the left in Britain, trying to support or working to support in Europe a different attitude, so, to help the rescue teams in Europe and do that. And there have been some parliamentary support in the EU, but it's very difficult to sustain, it seems, at all. And what we see in Europe in particular is the most incredibly disastrous situation for African people. And that's my main perspective, who are desperate to escape the most terrible repression and wars and climate change, and are trying to make a life, for themselves. Anyway, thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, David. Richard, we'll take a few more contributions, and then you'd like to come in. Now, Maddie, please.
Thank you. David's David is a hard act to follow. However, Richard, when I was much younger, I read a wonderful book about the meeting between the Catholic Church and the and communism. And in translation, which I read, it was called Don Camillo's Dilemma. And if you haven't read it, I think it's good for a giggle. What I really wanted to say, I mean, more seriously, is that you have, in your excellent talk, thank you very, very much, you didn't mention youth from Afghanistan. Now, I'm living in Sweden, and in Sweden, the big topic of migration is the youth from Afghanistan. Other people do come in, but the ones who hit the headlines are the youth from Afghanistan. And in 2015, which is one of the key years you mentioned, Sweden actually opened its doors to young men, usually men, unaccompanied children, and welcomed them. And then they closed them like everyone else did and got very nasty. Among their nastiness is a very unpleasant method of determining age, because they assume that all young people are liars. And they use a measure of the width or the height or the strength or something of the knee to determine whether a person is 18 years old or younger. Apparently something happens in the knee so that you can do this. I don't know, it's very controversial. And a lot of people who are accepted by Swedes as being children have had their age written up, and that puts them in the category that they can be returned to Afghanistan. A lot of them are Hazars, and the Hazars are have from generations, I understand, been under particular pressure by the rest of Afghanistan. And so you're actually sending people back to be killed. Some of them managed to escape. And I mean, it's terrible, terrible, terrible. A lot of them have learned Swedish. A lot of them have jobs. Some of them have jobs they've had for years. And yet they are being thrown out of these jobs and deported. And the result, of course, is when the administration's claws are coming towards you, what do? You escape. And living under the bridges of Paris today are very many Swedish-speaking Afghanis. I'd just like to know whether you can tell us anything more about the fate of these children, or what. I mean, they're obviously the ones who've been living there for years and now are grown-ups now. But many of them were children when they arrived. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Finn.
Yeah, comrades, I want to begin by thanking Richard for a very informative opening contribution. I'm speaking from Dublin, and I want to talk a bit about her experience here. But my question initially is, what successes do you have, or what's your experience been in building a mass movement of opposition to racist policies and to anti-immigrant protests as they emerge and as they develop in Italy. This is a very serious problem that we face, the building up of anti-immigrant and anti-asylum seeker attitudes. There was a survey published in the newspapers in Ireland and Dublin this morning, which showed that 70% of respondents think that this country has too many refugees. Now, that information or that attitude is not based on real information, because there's plenty of space here. There's lots of unused buildings. There's quite a low population here per size of the country. There's lots of buildings that can be converted into living accommodation for local people as much as for refugees. There's plenty of space. A lot of refugees or seekers of refugee status or asylum seekers are not allowed to work anyway. So there's all kinds of issues. But the danger is that 70% of people think that there's too many immigrants. And this then in turn is fodder for the growth of right-wing groups. Now, in Ireland, we have a group called decay, which is really the Irish translation of together, Irish language version of the expression together. To explain a piece where it came from. Incidentally, we had a demonstration in February where 50,000 people turned out to march through Dublin. And that 50,000 people was a true united front involving trade unions, NGOs, community groups, asylum-seeking groups, and so on. One of the main groups is a group whose initials are MASI, the Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland, led by a very left-wing and very progressive individual called Lucky Kambula from South Africa, as it happens. But how this movement like Kayla began? Like, I'm myself the president of Dublin Council of Trade Unions, and we began some years ago and linked up with some other similar thinking groups, and with a small organization called the Kayla, small group. Yet in February, with a mass demonstration involving the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, individual trades councils, individual trade unions, and several community groups, NGOs, Amnesty International, organizations like that. So we can't be complacent. The dangers are evident, as were shown in the figures. Incidentally, another figure that was interesting in this morning's survey was that 80% of Sinn Féin, that's a so-called left-wing group in Ireland, 80% of Sinn Féin voters think that there's 83% think there's too many foreign refugee and asylum seekers in Ireland. So there's a huge problem facing us. We've had 120 protests already this year, 2023, by anti-immigrant right-wing groups against the presence of asylum seekers. A lot of asylum seekers, quite a few, I think maybe 60 or 70, live in tents in the inner city. And there was an attack on that group by a right-wing gang 2 weeks ago, where they set fire to an encampment and burnt down the tents of refugees in the inner city, a place called Sandwich Street. Fortunately, there was no one injured because the people fled, and rightly so. Then they were moved, our group was moved to a remote location in Clare, a hotel. Clare's in the southwest, the remote area in the southwest of Ireland. An unused hotel, which was lying vacant, was then decreed by the government to be a location for asylum seekers, given the experience in inner city Dublin. There was a protest to prevent the arrival at that centre of asylum seekers. They came by bus. The road was blocked by tractors. Now, tractors wouldn't normally be in the possession of poor working class rural communities. So the people who led and organised that protest weren't people saying, we're too full here, we can't accommodate anybody else, because the people who own tractors wouldn't be in that category. But it does reflect an attitude. 120 protests since the beginning of the year. Now, this group that I'm involved with do organise counter-protests. I've been on a couple of them myself. On one occasion, there was a counter-protest in the inner city near a hotel called the Shelburne Hotel. We were bigger, far bigger than the right-wing groups, and the right-wing groups left. And of course, they got a very good send-off from our group. They turned up with the aim of causing problems. Didn't happen, so they fled. On the big demonstration of 50,000 I'm talking about, Tommy Robinson, who's the English fascist leader, was invited to Dublin on the day of the demonstration because nobody knew, including ourselves, how big our demonstration was going to be. It could be small, it could be big, we didn't know. So Tommy Robinson was invited over with a view to organising a counter march and with a bit of luck, a bit of violence and mayhem in the city as well. He came, was unnoticed. He didn't appear in public and he disappeared. He left the scene. There was no counter demonstration. There was no statement. There was no presence. He wasn't picked out. He was in Dublin. He wasn't picked up by the media or photographers. He came, he saw the movement and he fled. And that's the only way in which you can defeat these anti-immigrant protests. But getting back to my original question, Richard, thanks again for your contribution. But I'm interested to hear your experience of building a movement against the right, the anti-immigrant and the racist, the right. And with that, we could share experiences outside the context of this meeting. But I'm interested to hear, in general, how that movement against racism and against anti-immigrant feeling is developing in Italy. I saw a survey, just to conclude on this point, which the European Union conducted, and they found that 26% of the people surveyed by the European Union see immigration as the main issue. The vast majority see the cost of living, something like 60% have cost of living number one, which is significant in itself, by the way, whereas 26% see immigration as being a problem. That 26% is big. It's smaller than 60, but it's big. It's a lot of people, and it leaves themselves open to exploitation by right-wing groups, which are growing right across the world at the present time. So thanks again for your opening contribution, Richard. It's very informative, and you've increased all our knowledge of the issues as they emerged in Italy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you too, Finn. But we've got Carol next.
Once again, thank you for that historical layout of what's been happening. I'm probably going to go back and watch the video again because I'm sure there are things that I have forgotten or missed. I mean, the same thing is happening in the United States, and a lot of the immigrants who are coming in from Central, South America, Mexico, are coming into some of the most racist states in the United States. And now a lot of those immigrants are being sent to the liberal North, which is New York City. And there are plenty of buildings that have gone up that are for market value, but instead our mayor, everybody supports the Democratic Party in New York, wants to send them to prison, right, to occupy the prisons. So I mean, it's not that New Yorkers in particular have an anti-immigrant attitude, but the establishment, the capitalist class, has an anti-immigrant attitude. And there's no resolving this under capitalism. More and more people are going to be laid off, especially with AI. They're predicting millions of people will lose their jobs. And people are going to be moving and competing for jobs, you know, all the time. And it's going to engender, you know, anti-immigrant attitudes and the development of a fascist. In fact, there already is a development of a fascist movement in the United States. And they're quite militant, and they're going around shooting people. And just a couple of weeks back, there were immigrants from Venezuela who managed to make it into Texas, and this guy just said, you know, America for the Americans, who happened to be Hispanic, and he ran into them and killed 8 people and injured more. And then another situation where this guy had Nazi swastikas on his arm, shot in Texas also, because there's that anti-immigrant, especially in places like Texas and Florida and places like that are so reactionary that immigrants are being abused and rounded up by the police and by vigilantes. So anyway, there's a union leader who seems to be a communist. His name is Roberto Luci, who's the head of, I don't know if you know him, but he's the head of the logistics union in Italy, in Milan, I believe. And he's whatchamacallit, all of his members are immigrants from Africa, or I think largely from Africa, but he's organizing a conference starting on June 10th. You might want to look into this, about what's going on, developing a movement in Italy that will fight against anti-immigrants, that will fight to protect what he basically said the last time I didn't speak to him, I saw him on Zoom, that the immigrants are being attacked by the police, and they've been pretty successful in organizing and defending them. And I don't know how large it is. I don't know the span of who he's connected with. I was considering going to the conference, but it's on the 10th, and I just haven't been able to get it together to go there. But it's something.
Could you just tell me again the name of the guy? Roberto what?
Luci, Luzzi.
Okay, let me have a look.
So, in any case, he's having a conference, and this is, as I said, an international thing, and this has to be dealt with internationally, because capitalism is going to continue to require more and more profits, basically meaning, we've seen this all before, laying people off, pitting people against each other. Fascist movements are the only thing that will, unless there's a militant working class movement, as Finn said, that the fascists will step in. And I think that we have to worry about that everywhere, and build an international working class movement to overthrow capitalism. Yes.
Thank you very much, comrades. Richard, would you like to reply to some of those points, and then maybe we'll continue the discussion?
Yeah, I'll try. There's a kind of a general point about. Thanks for all the questions, because they're very stimulating. I think there's a general point about street movements, neo-fascism, what the state does, what happens from below, which I think is emerging from in the discussion. Just to deal with a couple of things before that, maybe a little more factual, before opening up the kind of more conceptual side. Just in terms of Afghanistan, I think there are two things that come to mind which are important to say there. One is I focused entirely on illegal maritime immigration from North Africa. There is also a lot of illegal immigration, or criminalized immigration, coming down into from Eastern Europe, which are often people from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, the so-called Balkan route, and also by boat from Turkey and Greece. In fact, on 26th of February, there was the big shipwreck at Cutro in Calabria. Those were people who had left from Turkey. In fact, the boat had left from Turkey, had gone to Greece and picked up more people, and the shipwreck happened in Italy, in Calabria. And those people were mainly from Afghanistan. So there are a lot of people who come over from Afghanistan, they go there, but then they move, they leave. Now, I kind of skipped over this. I said that in 2016, there was a hotspot system. People are forced to stay in Italy. That there's a way around that, which is, there are a couple of ways around it, but the main one is if you have statistically over a 75% chance of being accepted as a refugee based on your nationality, then you can go to a different European country, and it's likely that you can claim not to be sent back to Italy. So what happens if Afghans arrive by boat from Turkey and Greece into Italy? They don't claim asylum. They move on. They go to Germany or Sweden and so on. They claim asylum and then say, you can't send me back to Italy because I'm really, really a refugee. I don't know if I explained the situation well, which means that it's another reason that in Italy we see very few people coming and staying from Eritrea, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. They move on to Northern European countries generally. You also touched on the point, Mahdi, about unaccompanied foreign minors. I'm just gonna maybe slightly provocatively kind of push back against what you said about the how people's age is measured, and that people aren't believed. I think you're right that people's word should be, you know, if someone says I'm 17, we should believe them and let them be 17. But I mainly believe that because I know that a 17-year-old has a lot more rights than an 18-year-old does. I think that's insane. I think the system we've set up where people are forced to lie about age, and a lot of people do lie about their age, we force people to do it, right? In the same way that I've met several times, I've met people who are from Palestine. They're not from Palestine, they're from Morocco, but they know if they say they're from Palestine, they have more rights, and so on and so on. Like, almost all of the Eritreans who arrive are from Ethiopia, right? We force people to play this ridiculous game of denying their identity, of saying what their age is, what their gender is, what their nationality is, who they are, their story, because we want to fit them into the categories that have more rights. But the idea of rights is that everyone has them. So I want to push back against a lot of the discourse around we must protect the babies and the children. It's like, I think we should also protect the adults, and I don't mind if someone has 27, right? Obviously it's complicated, but I thought I'd just give that other side of the discussion. Just looking at my points. I completely agree about was it from David or Daniel at the beginning about the absolute freedom of capital and despotic control on the freedom of people. And I think we've seen that very much with I don't know how your discussions about this have gone, but with the attempts of economic boycott on Russia, which couldn't happen basically because capital is too free and imperialist powers are too connected to each other. So the European bloc and the NATO bloc knew that they couldn't do actual controls on Russian capital because it would hit their bloc just as much as or more than the NATO bloc. Just shows you how free capital is, even while freedom of movement on people is so restricted. Okay, so I think I'll come now to really the main point, which is about, I think there were different questions about neo-fascism and neo-fascist groups. And thank you, Finbar, very much for describing the situation in Ireland, about which I'm mainly ignorant. Though I knew the names of some of the groups you mentioned. I just, in Italy, the problem of street violence and of kind of organized right-wing presence that is not about representation in parliament, but a street presence is not much of a problem here. It's not, I mean, it has been, there have been moments, there was a moment in 2018, shortly before the election, when a gunman went and shot people in Macerata. He killed several people. That did happen. That's the episode that comes to mind. It's the only episode that comes to mind of a man with a gun going around taking pot shots at foreigners. I think our situation in Italy is a bit different because that anti-migrant element is so constant in politics, and happens at a higher level. So Finbar, in your description, I'm sure it's more complicated than this, but at least in the description you gave just now, you posited it as the government is trying to protect the asylum seekers. There are the right-wing groups that are standing there, coming with their tractors and burning the tents down. I'm sure it's more complicated than that, but that kind of opposition between the government trying to protect the people and these right-wing groups from the below that aren't, I think in our situation in Italy and is gradually becoming more and more like it is in Eastern Europe, where really it's the government that is trying to reject people, deport people, puts people in very bad conditions, is blocking people from having documents in any way, and then leaving people to be the new exploitable poor working class, the ultra poor working class that can be ultra exploited. I think there's maybe some error in communication between different cultures when Meloni is described as a neo-fascist. She is a neo-fascist in the sense that fascism was Italian. So she's not neo-fascist in the sense of kind of like Trumpian neo-fascist, like these strange kind of crackpot right-wing groups. She's neo-fascist in the sense that fascism is seen in parts of Italy as a very acceptable ideology. It's something that was part of politics. Fascist apologism and revisionism isn't something that happens on the fringes of society, or it's something that happens very high up. It happens in universities, it happens in politics, and I think has a different edge to it. She's called a neo-fascist because that's the political tradition she comes from. It's what we call here post-fascism, really, because there was a moment in the 90s when the right-wing parties that had been historically connected to fascism and had been founded by fascists in the 1950s reneged on the heritage of Mussolini. They said, no, we don't like that kind of fascism. They mainly said it because they wanted to be neoliberals. They mainly said it because they said, we don't want the fascist legacy that is corporatist or talks about the working class. We actually just want a nice neoliberal version of the extreme right wing. And that's what we call post-fascism. So a slightly different playing field. I think that comes on to the point about how to build a mass movement. And it might be that, Finbar, you have much more experience in this than I do. I don't think we have been very successful. It's certainly true that over the past couple of years, immigration has stopped being the #1 topic in the kind of polls that you talked about. And that goes for Italy as well. 2016, 17, 18, it was always the #1 point was immigration in electoral polls. Then obviously it became COVID, and now it is also here the cost of living crisis. I'm not sure we can see it as a victory. Obviously, the cost of living crisis has taken the place because people are really facing such huge problems. I think one thing we can say, though, about the certain success, I don't know, I'm going to push this. I'll make this point. I think maybe it convinces me only to a certain degree, but I'm going to make it. I think that our success maybe is in the fact that we have a very solid and long-standing approach to migrant solidarity, which was incredibly unpoliticized and is widespread in the population, like I've said several times, mainly because of the influence of the Catholic Church here, which has consistently said, you must welcome people, has a very strong internationalist line, which pushes back against the sovereignist line, talks about brotherhood and sisterhood and unity and so on. And I think has been much more successful at doing that than the left. I think the left I think we've consistently failed to talk about this as a class politics and to say, we are welcoming the working class. These are our working class brothers and sisters who are from different countries. We have no nations. They are part of us. So we will defend them and we will march with them and we will organize them. And I think that the point that Carol, that you made about the logistics unions, the union, it would be COBAS. I should have said at the beginning, so I'm in Palermo in Sicily. I'm right down in the south. So I have quite a different view on a lot of things, particularly in terms of immigration and anti-racism. We see the landings happening. We go to the ports. We see people when they arrive. All of the logistics stuff is right up in the north. So right up in the north. So here, there is no logistics organizing. We have no logistics factories. We have no COBAS. It is meaningless to us. It's been really important on an international scale, and it's been very important up in the north. Most of the non-Italian workers that COBAS organize are from Morocco, Romania, and Albania. There are also Senegalese, but mainly people who, the vast majority have arrived by legal means, and also people who've been here for 20, 30 years. So it's important to connect those struggles. It's also important to see some of the differences. It is not the case that people arriving by boat into Sicily over the past 5 years are now working in logistics factories and being organized by a trade union up in the north. That hasn't happened. Also, COBAS is a very small but very militant union, so it's incredibly unrepresentative. of what's happening with the trade union movement on a national scale. But do send over the information about that conference. I would definitely like to see what they're up to. I'm sure that's probably enough points to get other discussions going. Though I'm interested to open up that point about what people mean by fascism and neo-fascism, and yeah.
Can you send your email address and I'll forward whatever information I have?
I'll put it in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thanks, Richard. There's plenty of time for further discussion. I see Ed has his hand up, and there's plenty of time for other colleagues to come in too. So, Ed, over to you.
Yeah, Richard, thank you very much for your talk and your subsequent comments as well. It's very interesting, and you're obviously doing, important work and very involved with these issues. I don't know if I fully understood one of the points that you most recently made in your last contribution. We're talking about how to build a movement against fascism. I thought I heard you say that we've been successful because we haven't been very political. Maybe I misunderstood that. Working with the Catholic Church, an idealist movement, welcoming everyone into the country. Now, that's not my experience of dealing with fascist views, and discussing it. I mean, I've been a trade union shop steward. I've been trade union activist. Talk about these things at work in a variety of different workplaces and so on. If we're just talking about, as the Catholic Church would, we have to love our neighbours, we've got no answer to the issue of the arrival of poverty-stricken immigrants from other countries tends to force wages down. And one of the reasons, certainly, in the British working class where I've been active, one of the reasons you get a risk that some people will be drawn into fascist and racist ideas, or at least ideas about controlling the amount of immigration and not having so many immigrants here in the country, is precisely because it's not an idealist issue. It's an issue of how the working class can fight back against low wages and the need for solidarity of working people, irrespective of whether they're recent immigrants or whether their heritage is of an immigration, of earlier generations. It's got to be a concrete issue that is highly political. That's about how we change society to make it less exploitative and fairer for working people. And I mean, fine, if you've found some people in the Catholic Church who you could work with to reduce social antagonisms, I'm not in principle against it, but I am surprised that if anyone's saying that we can just defeat racism and fascism on the basis of a kind of love your neighbor, Catholic Church kind of approach, to be truthful, I think they're talking nonsense, because it's not my experience. We have to have concrete answers. How are we going to get jobs? How are we going to get well-paid jobs? How are we going to get people into unions? When immigrants do come into the country, how are we going to get them involved in the union movement that we already have and strengthen it and build it and make them comrades together with the rest of us? That maybe I misunderstood you, Richard, but that's my question. I personally don't think I would get very far trying to work with the Catholic Church on these matters. Although obviously, if there were issues where there were Catholics who were working on the same lines as me, I would have no objection to working with them.
Can I come back on that now, because I feel like
okay, sure, come on.
it's nice and precise. I really agree with you, Ed. I think there's a couple of things. One is what I kind of wanted to say was, if we have had any success, and it's on the basis of I think it's mainly on the basis of not just the Catholic Church, and I think that's probably the wrong way of putting it, but more of the Catholic principles that are widespread in society in Italy. That's if we've had success. We haven't been that successful. We currently have a neo-fascist at the head of the government, so we clearly, it's not been enough. I think when I talk about, like you talk about going into workplaces or going on the street and convincing people, I think certainly from my experience as an activist in the UK and my experience or in London and as an activist here, there's just like a much wide, right, it's a Catholic country. I don't know if the Irish comrades would say the same, but it means that the language that I can speak to people in, I don't do it. I'm not religious, I don't have that background, but I see how strong it is and how much it can bring people together and how much that the kind of the left Catholic movements managed to talk in a language, or even when kind of liberals or the soft left talks in terms of like universal humanity, I think it gets to people in a way that I think it arrives at people in a way more here than maybe in the UK or in London. I think maybe that would be more acceptable if I were talking about how important Gramsci was and how important Gramsci and the Communist Party was to Italians. But unfortunately, it's just not so true. It's the Catholic principles that kind of come out a lot more. I think that's the limit of our success as well, because exactly, we don't have that big working class organized movement, and the trade unions at the moment are being terrible because they're doing everything but calling a general strike. Got incredible strikes in the UK, incredible strikes in France. There's nothing in Italy. But the trade unions are deciding just to be kind of movementists and activists, and they're not talking about organizing workers. So I agree with you on that. A slightly more complicated thing, I think, is what you said about people seeing is that this is an issue about workers believing, or it effectively being, that immigration pulls down wages. I think there's 2 points that come to mind there. One is that Italy is a country of net emigration. More Italians leave Italy than non-Italians arrive in Italy. And I think that it makes it a bit different from other countries, from the UK, for example. Because if people know that the problem of the Italian economy is not the arrival of immigrants, because it's been going on a lot, the economy's been in trouble before and after. The fact that immigration is so low now, that the right wing's been so successful, and the centre left, the state has been so successful in blocking illegal immigration, means it's very difficult for them to blame it all on the boats. Because that big spectacle, like I said before, the people arriving on boats is actually quite a small proportion of immigration to Italy. But that big spectacularized moment has kind of, it happens a lot less. And the economy is tanking. Italy is in a terrible situation. Like in Sicily, youth unemployment in Sicily is worse than Greece. We have 52% youth unemployment. We have very large emigration. So I think that also changes it. It means when you go and talk to workers, to a point about what is going on with economic conditions, people are much more likely in Sicily to talk about the crisis on a European level and the fact that all their children are going abroad to work, more than about immigrants coming over. And just lastly on that, I think it's also to do with sectors. So most newly arrived immigrants in Italy, certainly people coming from African countries, work without contracts, without a minimum wage, in hyper exploitative work, where they're not competing with Italians. I'm sure on a large economic level, we can talk about it still dragging wages down, but I think people don't see their jobs being replaced like that. And that just comes to mind.
Okay, thank you. I see Silvana has a hand up. Please come in. Silvana?
Sorry.
Yeah, hi. Hello, hi.
I mean, being immigrant myself, I can talk from my point of view. When I came here, United States, I didn't know English at all. So I think if you give opportunity to people, they would bring the best of you, of them. And I think people who is immigrant, I mean, they are different. They are like hungry, like for food, and they are hungry to succeed. So there is no way they're going to stop them. And I think sometimes just jealousy, you know, being an immigrant, being successful in other country, make people to believe that they don't have the rights to be there, to be here. But people don't want to stay in other country. We would rather be in their own country. Nobody wants to go to another country. Ask yourselves if you'd like to live in another country. Start all over again, like if you were a baby that you didn't know nothing. Nobody would respect you. Nobody respect you. Nobody look at you and think that you are a person. And then if you open the borders, people would come and they would pay tax, they would buy goods, they would be a good employers. What's wrong with that? And then they would go home. But no, they create such a big problem, such a big deal that people need to be like, act like a criminal. Right now, DeSantis here in Florida is the worst governor ever. He doesn't take care of the environment. He doesn't take care of the people here. He just prohibits books, abortions. I mean,
Oh. Silvana, are you there? Maybe I see David and Finn have their hands up, perhaps while we're waiting for Silvana to get back in contact. Oh, David, your hand is not up now, yeah? Finn.
Yeah, just a couple of points. I wouldn't want to give the impression, I hope I didn't, that the Irish government is playing some kind of a progressive role with regard to immigration. They're not, on the contrary. The Minister for Justice has been boasting recently that there are more people being deported when he's minister than was the case in the past. Also, when people arrive here as immigrants, they're sent to centres, national centres, and from there then they get sent to emergency accommodation, largely in hotels, and they can be waiting for up to 4 months for their cases to be processed. If they're fortunate and they get what's called a PPS card, they then receive a weekly allowance of €38 per week. Now, it's worth going across the dangerous waters of the Mediterranean to end up in a place where you get €38 a week. So I wouldn't want to give the impression at all that the Irish government is playing progressive role. And just a further point on that, 500 people who arrived here recently were told there is nowhere to stay. That's the official statement that's made to them. And they end up living on the streets in tents. And that's why you get people being attacked on the streets. No, it's not a common practice. There's only one incident where tents were burnt, but the people are being told that there is nowhere for you to stay. So when they leave the office, where are they supposed to go? Other than sleep on the streets. So I wouldn't want to give an impression at all that the government is progressive. And just a point of information, there is no left Catholic movement in Ireland. None. The Catholic Church is viewed with disdain here, not just because of the issue of child abuse, which is very widespread, or was very widespread, but also the question of church property and church wealth. There's a massive amount of buildings being in the possession of the church, which could be used to house refugees and asylum seekers, but it's been held with a view to selling them in the private market, and it's in the hand of agents. So there is no left Catholic movement here. And just one final point, which I'd like to mention in terms of discussion. The history of colonialism is what's behind all of this crisis, and we haven't mentioned it to date. But at the close of the 19th century, 90% of Africa was under the control of European powers. All of them, Spain, England, all of them, Germany, they all had French, they all had properties. And the legacy of division, inequality, sectarianism, and all that, that's all a legacy of colonialism. So it didn't just come from nowhere. I mean, all this racism are people who are the inequality and poverty they suffer is a responsibility of colonialism, particularly European colonialism in other continents. And even in Afghanistan, there was a colonial conflict between Britain and Russia in particular, where each of the countries in turn just used Afghanistan as their own basis to try and, well, basically colonial interests were being served. So we just need to make note of that point, that this immigration and inequality and poverty didn't just suddenly crop up. I mean, there are issues about climate change, poverty, famine, such as in Somalia at the moment, where maybe 1 million people are being displaced as a direct consequence of drought. But none of that is inevitable. All of that is a consequence of the division and inequality which were generated by the colonial powers for Europe. And this is the residue of that control which they had. I think that requires a mention as well, that immigration doesn't come from nowhere. It's a consequence of European colonialism.
Okay, thank you, Finn. I think Silvana is with us again now. Is that right? And do you want to come back?
Sorry, my son called me.
Hi.
I am on my cell phone. Anyway, like I was saying, people don't want to come and go on a boat or in a foot or come to the frontiers to try to cross. I mean, die, get raped, get robbed. Nobody wants that. It's the capitalism. Why they go to their countries and destroy our democracy? Why they do that? You know, now we are supposed to just die. You need to be courageous to try to cross the frontiers. I mean, and then go to another country and start all over again. So, I mean, this capitalism, they don't care about if your people in their own countries are dying for food, because they go there, they try to dominate the people. They want to impose that democracy to the South America. I mean, this is ridiculous. We are the people. When we want change, we go for change. Don't try to, you know, dominate us. So now, all these people here in America, they created. This went on, was not even, I mean, the Biden said, now let's finish this, nobody's coming in. Let's close the frontiers, that's fair. I mean, that's fair. If he had helped the people, try to give them jobs, see what they can help with the economy, and they would work here, they would pay tax, they would work cutting the grass, cleaning, in the restaurants, minimum wage. They pay minimum wage, $7, $10, I don't know, even $10 right now. And people are over there dying for food. Here, people don't, they need jobs. People, they are offering jobs. People cannot go, American people don't want to work in those jobs that are underpaid. So the immigrants could work here and go home, see their families. You know, the economy would get better. People would buy more. People would produce more. I don't understand, you know. They rather see people dying for food or for drinking water and then giving them jobs. That's sad. I mean, that's very sad. And I forgot what I was going to say, but doesn't make no sense at all. and DeSantis now wants to be the president. We immigrants, we are not voting him. I'm not voting him. And we should not vote for him because he's going to be worse than Trump. Like Bolsonaro was the devil for Brazil. So DeSantis is going to be the same. So I don't see DeSantis as a president. He's not going to bring good to the Americans. He's not going to bring good to the people around the world. Fascist in the power with Elon Musk. I mean, come on, guys. Where are we going? I don't understand. And when UK left the European Union, I was very sad because people just want to work and go home and see their family. If you have a bird, you put him in a cage and give him food and water, but you don't allow him to go to the forest, they are not happy. People are the same. We like freedom like the Americans. We want to live free. I mean, I don't know. The world is totally going in the wrong direction. After 2008, they start like putting their flags and going against the immigrants. That was so sad. That was like the worst time of my life that I looked at the Americans and I was like, it's not our fault. It's not our fault. It's not all the immigrants' fault. It was some people did. We are not proud of it, but it's nothing to do with us. So I don't know. Not DeSantis here in Florida. I mean, I'm glad that he lives in Florida. He can go try to be the president, but he's not going to win because we're going to fight. Oh, I forgot. July the 2nd on the streets.
Silvana, thank you. Very good contribution and very poetic, if I may say so. Thanks very much. Anthula now, please.
Hello. I'd first like to thank you very much, Richard, for such an insightful presentation. And of course, congratulations and all the best for your work with ARCI, a great organization we have worked with. I mean, my organization, GISA, in Cyprus. I would like to focus my brief intervention on one of the theses of the presentation, that is the exploitation or use of extreme right or explicitly racist far-right parties, and to actually point out that I think we also have to add in our struggle the very basis of the institution, rather, that actually accommodates these extreme right political parties. And I'm talking about the European Union itself. As you all know, in the center of the so-called refugee crisis in 2015, the European Union actually tried to export this crisis, in inverted commas, by signing the agreements of shame with Turkey and other neighboring countries, with paying these countries literally to get rid of the refugees that came to Europe or would have come to Europe. In addition, it is the European Union that has actually has done nothing about repeated and multiple pushbacks of migrants and refugees, especially at sea, and the death of so many thousand people in the Mediterranean, not to speak of the Aegean, Evros, etc. Also, the reinforcement of Frontex and their cooperation with national enforcement, police and military at borders internally and externally. The barbed walls that the European Union itself is now actually funding. And these walls, may I remind us all, that I think now cover the borders of more than 19 EU member states. And of course, the installation of AI and other surveillance systems, other borders and elsewhere that violate the very basic human rights of anybody crossing those borders, and of course mostly refugees and migrants. To add one thing that I think Richard has used, it's a word, and I know that we shouldn't actually concern ourselves with semantics, but can we, on the left, call people attempting to find a place of refuge? Can we call these people illegal migrants? Why? International Refugee Convention does not accept that one is illegal, however they try to apply for international protection. And of course, what I'm saying is that the European Union is actually, with this and other policies and measures, is actually shifting to the right and at times to the extreme right in relation to refugees, to asylum and migration. This shift is epitomized in the EU Council implementation decision for temporary protection to Ukrainians fleeing the war. No other group of refugees has actually been accorded this openness of the European Union. Only Ukrainians, who of course are blonde and blue-eyed. So, and we actually don't we need to focus our struggles also against this shift of the European Union? Many countries, like for example, the Cypriot government and the Greek government, they are all supposedly conservative, democratic nevertheless, but their policies on migration and asylum is actually has created a racist narrative, a hostile environment for refugees and migrants, and they focus their policies on deterrence, refugee deterrence, as the key objective of their policies. What I'm saying is we need to direct our action and struggle against this widespread and very powerful EU policy on refugees and asylum. Thank you very much again, Richard. Such a wonderful presentation.
Oh, thank you very much, Chandula. David, and then I think that will be, if there's any other comrades who haven't spoken, please get in quickly, okay? Because we're drawing towards the end of our time. But David.
Yeah, thanks. Look, just some broad points. You know, when we're looking at migration, we should look at it in terms of combined and uneven development. I mean, what we have in the main capitalist nations is an extraordinary combination of capital, highly trained labor, and a demand for labor at all levels, actually. There's a change in the demographics in Britain, in China, and in the United States with a rapid acceleration of incomes. Well, historically, that's in the past in Britain and also in America, but in China now, basically, they're running out of young working class people. The only solution around the world in any economy is to allow immigrants to come in, people who are prepared to have larger families. And by the way, that's certainly the case in America, who are prepared to dedicate themselves to becoming technically proficient in different ways and to take advantage of even in capitalism, there are chances to go through community colleges and all the rest of it, which are totally unavailable in the countries from which these people come. So what we're seeing is objective processes as well as political crises, and we need to have our eyes wide open to that, because those objective processes are particularly what the right wing are trying to use and abuse. There's another factor, though, I'd like to bring in, is that the struggle for democracy and citizenship increases the crisis around who's a citizen and who's not a citizen. Now, in a way, this has taken centuries of struggle in Europe. Who is a citizen and what entitlements do you have as a citizen? But in South Africa, it came very acutely with the elections in 1994 and a new constitution. All services are extended to citizens and not to non-citizens. Now, that means immediately people who were previously regarded as South Africans because they lived in South Africa, they might have come from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Namibia, even Central Africa and so forth, are suddenly not South Africans and can be denied access to schools and to hospitals. And we've had the obscenity of one of the ministers actually going to a hospital and trying to kick out people from the hospital because he said they were not citizens, and he wanted well, actually it was a she wanted those people to be kicked out of the hospitals when they were desperately ill. Can you believe such barbarity? Because it's all derived around the definition of citizenship. Why I'm mentioning this is that because we will, if we advance to socialism, a higher level of society, there will be an enormous pole of attraction of people around the world to come there and just to live a better life, because that will be denied to them in the countries from which they come. And that will create a number of tensions. I only raise this as an idea. Therefore, we have to have continuous revolution. We have to be able to move from one country to the other to see revolutionary forces. And we need such a strong international as we're trying to build so that we can deal with such contradictions, such sharp edges to combined and uneven development, and give hope for countries which are beyond a hope at the moment to be able to develop into even development and an even distribution. As Silvana said, not all of us want to leave our country to be abused, exploited, and all the rest of it. In fact, we don't want it. We would like to see an evening out of all the opportunities for life in the world, and that comes through socialism. Thank you.
All right, thank you, David. I think if there's no other comrades, so Richard, would you like to sum up?
Yeah, sure. I'll just come back on a couple of things. Thanks. Yeah, it's been really interesting. The comrade from Cyprus spoke about the EU and the EU's rightward shift, and I think that is really important. There are EU elections in a year's time. So at the moment, the political alliances are happening. People have to pick candidates. Everything's kind of a buzz. It's possible, as it was last time they happened, it's possible that the elections will put Europe in the hands of the far right. If it doesn't go in the hands of the far right, we're seeing anyway this rightward shift over the past few years, and I think that's definitely true. And it's very difficult to see how we can get out of that trap in terms of the at an EU level. In terms of what we can do about this and building socialism and building the movements that are necessary, it's not all of the answer, but I think an important part of that answer is to recognize the extraordinary resistance that is being built and that is enacted every day by people who challenge the border regime. So when we talk about hundreds of thousands of people on the move towards Europe, we're also talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are resisting and are a movement, sometimes in extraordinarily organized ways that we don't see, right? And sometimes in ways that just get spoken about as traffickers or smugglers, but might actually be organizations that are pushing against and building underground roads to get into Europe and dismantle that regime. And I think that's, as I try to kind of show, I think that movement has happened, it has had huge effects, and it continues to happen. I still want to slightly push back against the idea of welcoming refugees and recognizing that international law protects asylum seekers, and you can't talk about an illegal asylum seeker, because I think this category can often, not always, the category of refugees has a long and rich tradition, but I think it can, in our current moment, it can do more harm than good, because it can push aside the important resistance of young Tunisian men who are leaving their country, not because they can't find a job, but because they just want to come to Europe, or someone who just wants to come to see their family in Europe, right? They're not refugees. They're not running away from war zones. They might be running away from an economic crisis, but I don't think that should be the point. The point is we have an insane racist visa regime, and I'll close on this point, which is intricately connected to geopolitics and to an international political level. And it's not only racist. And I think it was very important that there was the discussion of colonialism. And we could have done 2 hours talking about Italian colonialism and its heritages. But I think while it's incredibly important to talk about that colonial heritage, I think it's also important to look at what's happening right now in terms of international politics. Some examples of that. The majority of people who are deported from Italy by force are from Tunisia. That's because there's a very good economic relationship between Italy and Tunisia. They sign deals. It's an exploitative relationship. The same is now starting to happen with the Gambia and Senegal. It wasn't like that. People from Gambia weren't deported, ex-British colony, weren't deported from Italy until a couple of years ago. Now it's starting to happen. Why? Because the Gambian government changed a few years ago. They got rid of their dictator, which we're very happy about. They now have a new president who is closer to the EU and the international community and is starting to cut the same kind of deals. So it is, on the one hand, a legacy of colonialism, but I think it's also important that we look at, and exactly the kind of meetings that we're doing right now, we build the connections between the different nation states in which we're living in order to actually question and problematize the deals that our nations are doing between each other, or the capitalist powers that run them. And so much, I mean, the more you learn about it, so much of what happens in terms of immigration to the EU is just a ridiculous game of politics. We saw it with the Ukrainians, right? We have allies in a war so the Ukrainians could come. And you see it with Turkey, right? Like Turkey, it's much easier for people from Turkey to get into into Europe on all sorts of visa regimes and open a business and you can come in and so on because there are economic ties. So I think it is important we talk about racism, it is, and white supremacism and the legacies of colonialism. I think it's also important to look at what's happening very much on a geopolitical level and in terms of how migrants get used and immigration gets used as a football between different countries in diplomatic deals.
Okay, well, look, I'd like to thank David very much. It was a really, really useful, informative, stimulating talk and discussion. And look, you're very welcome to come to our WIN meetings every week. I think the discussion has been in our best traditions. It was very open, it was very democratic, it was very internationalist. I saw that I think there were comrades from 8 countries who participated in the discussion today. And of course, we talk not just for the sake of it or for, as a hobby, but of course, this all goes towards building an international consciousness and beginning to build the foundations of what is needed desperately by people all over the world, which is a workers' international, which can genuinely take the world forward. And I think this will equip us to really fight for that goal. Now, I'd just like to tell comrades that the meeting next week is going to be on in a way a related topic, because we're fighting racism, nationalism, sectarianism, communalism, and so on. And one of the places where those evils have really raised their ugly heads is in Northern Ireland. And we have a comrade from Northern Ireland, Kieran, who was here earlier, but who had to leave before the end of the meeting. But he'll be speaking next week on the perspectives in Northern Ireland, particularly following the quite important elections that took place last week, which brought Sinn Féin as the biggest party for, I think, the first time, and all the implications of nationalism and sectarianism in Northern Ireland and, of course, internationally. So I look forward to seeing comrades then. Thanks to everybody who participated, and goodbye, comrades.